you're seeing, sort of operations at a scale that would have been unimaginable even in World War One. So this is a kind of citizen soldier army that I like to say has enough professional soldiers to become really good and reasonably well led, but not so many that it's just destroyed by corruption and careerism.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are pleased to bring you another episode of BRI Scholar Talks. For this episode, we're really honored to have scholar John McManus, who is going to discuss his new book, Island Infernos, the U.S. Army's Pacific War Odyssey in 1944, which is the second volume of a great trilogy he's writing on the U.S. Army in the Pacific Theater during World War II. And the first volume was the excellent Fire and Fortitude, which covered the 1941 to 1943 period. And the guiding question for this episode is, what was the contribution of the U.S. Army to the American victory against Japan in the Pacific War during World War II? Now, Dr. John C. McManus is Curators Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. And he's the author of more than a dozen excellent books on military history and World War II, including The Americans at D-Day, The American Experience of the Normandy Invasion, and Alamo in the Ardennes. The untold story of the American soldiers who made the defense of Bastogne possible. His website is johncmcmanus.com. John, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
Yeah, Appreciate I mean, you have a great bookshelf of books on World War II and military history. Read most of them. Really excited to talk with you. And your trilogy is really, really important. Really giving us we focus so much on the U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific, and they deserve a lot of attention, of course. It's just an amazing story of perseverance fighting the Pacific War. And yet, in a lot of ways, the U.S. Army has been overshadowed a bit, maybe overlooked a bit. So your trilogy has some really great books of highly readable, great narratives. So
I really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, to me, as a military historian and one who has studied World War II in great depth, and especially like the U.S. in World War II, because I'm also an American historian. It just seemed to me there was this enormous gap in our kind of popular memory of the Pacific War, that it seemed as though there was a sense that the Marines had fought the war on the ground against Japan, and then the Army focused on Europe. And actually, yes, the Army did focus on Europe, but also the Pacific too. So that in the Pacific, you've got an army of 1.8 million soldiers, ground soldiers, who serve in the Pacific or on the Asian continent throughout World War II. That's the third largest ground army this country's ever sent overseas to fight a war. So it was relatively anonymous, and I felt like maybe this was some sort of kind of new way we could look at World War II and gain a lot of lessons too.
Great. And I'd like to dial in on that a little bit, if I may. The typical story of the Pacific War seems to be that the U.S. Marine Corps did sort of the heavy lift of fighting aggressively against the Japanese. They were the ones storming the pillboxes with their satchel charges and grenades. And meanwhile, sort of the U.S. Army depended upon firepower and got slogged down a lot and sort of lacked that same fighting spirit that the Marines had. Did correcting this view maybe help you inspire you to write the book as well on the U.S. Army?
Absolutely, because I've been studying American combat soldiers for decades, and of course that included soldiers and Marines in the Pacific. And one of the things I found in studying the combat soldier, and then also in this trilogy, soldiers and Marines fought in a very similar fashion. I think there's been a bit too much historical fixation on the idea that the Marines were sort of gung-ho and went straight at the Japanese and, took the bunkers, like you said, and all that, and that the Army was more deliberate and all that. And of course, the Army, its doctrine was shaped on the idea of continental littoral warfare and having more artillery. And obviously the Army dealt with logistics, whereas the Marines didn't deal with that as much. So of course, there was some level of deliberation in the Army way of fighting that that maybe is there more so than the Marines, but really when you look at what actually happened in combat, they fought so similarly, and there was enormous respect. Yeah, so in writing this trilogy, my purpose was really not to denigrate the Marine Corps. In fact, I think you come away with an even greater respect because you realize contextually how few Marines there really were. The Marines did 15 amphibious invasions in the course of the war. Robert Eichelberger's Eighth Army in the Philippines in spring 1945 alone does 35. So it shows you that kind of wider lens, that you have a relatively small Marine Corps fighting alongside larger Army forces, sometimes in tandem with them, perhaps. And so I think really they forged quite an effective partnership with some tension at times, primarily because of quarrels of senior officers, more so than the average guy. And so I think, that's to me one of the great takeaways of this is the Marines and the Army both extremely well, and I think quite similarly, more so than we popularly supposed, I think.
Right, excellent. And what I also love about the trilogy is you give us kind of a meta view of the Pacific War as well. You give us the larger view, and you really discuss the nature of the war in the Pacific between the Americans and Japanese as well. So I was just thinking, can you give us a sense of maybe their relative advantages, maybe the sources of the racial antipathy on both sides,
Oh,
because there
yeah.
was certainly a lot of that, and just the
Mhm.
cultural differences in fighting the war.
Yeah, and there's major cultural and racial differences, of course, that shape the war. One of the things I try to provide in the trilogy is the Japanese perspective, and especially of the average soldier, which also I think tends to get lost, at least in Western minds. And you see, beyond the kind of fanaticism or whatever that is sort of still prevalent in popular memory for good reason. You see the mindset of the average Japanese soldier thinking of himself often as a liberator, that this is a war of liberation, to dismantle white colonial empires in Asia and the Pacific. And many of them are absolutely stunned, especially in the Philippines, when they're not welcomed, when they are hated, when they end up battling insurgents and all this, when they're shocked that Filipinos tend to be pro-American. And you see it in the South Pacific, you see it in many places. You also see through Japanese diaries that were captured by US soldiers, you see also the same fear and terror and antipathy and hunger and all the things you'd see on the American side. What is, I think, a little disquieting from an American perspective is when you look at average soldier accounts from the time, contemporary, as they were then, you really do see a lot more racial antipathy in American letters and American accounts than you do in Japanese accounts. To be sure, you see it in both, but it's really much more prevalent in US accounts. And there are pejorative terms that we would think of as very racist today that were sort of part and parcel that everyone used from FDR on down. So yeah, but the fundamental tragedy of it, I think, is in the end, from my perspective as a historian, looking at these average soldiers, they're the young men, and they're not all that different in many ways. And I came up with a really profound sense of tragedy that this conflict ever happened.
Right. Yeah, it was terrible, brutal war in the
Mm.
Pacific. And something you've written a lot about, you've written entire books about this subject. But my next question is, what was the experience of the average American GI fighting on the ground in the Pacific? I mean, they were storing beaches and pillboxes, fighting under just the most difficult circumstances, terrible jungle conditions, weather, disease, maybe fighting the elements as much as this sort of brutal war down on the ground and this sort of hand-to-hand combat frequently. So
Mhm.
can you just give us a little sense of sort of the drama?
It's just so enervating, in part because of the conditions. There's so much jungle combat in the Pacific, in the South Pacific especially, where it's just a challenge just to exist in jungle where you can't see 3 feet in front of you, and where you're dealing with places rife with disease. I mean, at one point in the New Guinea campaign, 1943, MacArthur's army has 4 or 5 guys down with malaria for every one lost to the Japanese in combat. So you're dealing with that and extreme weather conditions of like monsoon rains and the heat and all that. And of course, when the combat does happen, the ferocity is I think on par with anything the worst that you'd see in World War II, because there's generally no quarter aster given on either side. And in most cases, if you're attacking the Japanese, they're going to fight to the death, and all of that is very true. And the Japanese, I argue, were much better on defense than offense. On offense, they didn't have a good grasp of combined arms and staff planning. They didn't have the logistics. I don't think that the Americans really could do so well. And so that meant they were moving straight into your firepower quite often. And so they're really playing into your hands, though it's terrifying as a U.S. soldier to deal with a banzai assault or whatever. When you are attacking them and they're hunkered down in any kind of prepared position, this is a really formidable enemy. And so you're talking about a lot of combat casualties too, and sometimes in close-in fighting. So that's why the Thompson submachine gun is such a powerful weapon in the Pacific, because it's very deadly inside of 50 yards. So that, of course, flamethrowers eventually as you get going, satchel charges, grenades, good combined arms work. Like we tend to think of tanks and associate them with Europe. And of course, it's true. You have armored divisions in Europe, but there's tanks involved in the Pacific War all the way through. And the pattern is, as the war moves farther north, it tends to then focus not as much on jungle fighting, but cave fighting. And that really, I would argue, is even more traumatic and more difficult, especially, of course, once you get to like Okinawa and portions of the Philippines, where you're just seeing like cave to cave struggle. Biak is another example in June 1944. So yeah, this is not for the faint of heart, to fight this war.
Right. I mean, your descriptions are just so compelling and so moving. And we just, sitting in the comforts of our offices, our homes, I just can't imagine fighting in these kinds of conditions. It's horrible.
It is. Yep.
So so that's a great view of the GIs on the ground. Let's talk maybe a little bit about the generals and some of their personalities. Like, we of course have Douglas MacArthur sort of overshadowing everyone, but also maybe lesser known figures in the popular imagination or taught in classrooms, figures like Robert Eichelberger, Walter Kruger, other compelling figures. What were maybe some of the tensions in the U.S. Army High Command that maybe we don't normally talk about, and maybe talk a little bit about their different leadership styles, and maybe which were the most effective, and maybe effective in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, MacArthur being MacArthur, he kind of sucks the oxygen out of the room in a way, and he's this sort of Zeus-like figure, and he thinks of him as such, as certainly like the lead actor in the Pacific theater. But of course, as we know, I mean, he's not in control of the whole theater. He just has the Southwest Pacific area, and he sees then Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Ocean area as a rival and all that business. And you basically have this sort of two-pronged assault to Japan. And so some of the Army leaders are under Nimitz's auspices and operating at like the corps and division level. And then obviously you have MacArthur and his folks who are operating at a theater level and armies. And really the main thing that comes out of this is a kind of an intense rivalry between MacArthur's two key commanders, ultimately his two Army commanders, Walter Kruger, 6th Army, and Robert Eichelberger, 8th Army. Now, I argue in this series that Eichelberger is probably pound for pound the best U.S. ground commander in World War II, who is not well known, and I'm talking like at the Army level. He is an outstanding operational commander, and happily enough for a historian, he's part historian too in documenting everything he did, the letters he wrote home, the diary he kept, later year dictations about his experiences, anything you can imagine. He wrote an incredible memoir called The Road to Tokyo, Our Jungle Road to Tokyo. Kruger was more circumspect and brusque, but no less remarkable in many ways, because he's so self-made. He joined the Army as a 17-year-old immigrant private from Prussia. Teaches himself English, spoke hardly with an accent. He spoke French and Spanish. He was a military scholar. He didn't even have a high school diploma, and he becomes a 4-star general. So he's one of only 2 foreign-born generals in the U.S. Army in World War II, the other being Ben Lear, who was born in Canada. And I don't know if that really counts, in the same way. So why is there the rivalry between Kruger and Eichelberger? Part because MacArthur plays one off against the other, for the purpose of constantly driving and getting results, which makes sense. But in part because their personalities just didn't mesh. Eichelberger was extraordinarily cordial, and he had hardly any enemies. He's just a very enjoyable person to be with. He was polite, he was solicitous, he was inspirational, he was sensitive, probably overly sensitive at times. Kruger was certainly as thoughtful, but he was brusque and he could be rude, and so the way he dealt with Eichelberger was often very callous, and Eichelberger could not forgive that. And so what I saw in sort of researching not just them, but like all the people who worked for them, which is an incredible amount of source material, is that the real rivalry in some ways was among the staff members who then took this sort of rivalry on and latter year tried to shape perception. So I really had to be careful with that and kind of figure out who was saying what and why they were saying what they were saying. But it really is an incredible kind of human story.
Right. Excellent. And so the second volume in the trilogy is 1944. That's the focus. And so, why does 1944 witness sort of this turning of the tide of the U.S. Army after some initial very tough struggles and battles, and eventually turn the tide in the Pacific War?
Of course, the Army, like the U.S. itself, is, unprepared for the war when it comes at the end of 1941, pays a terrible price in the Philippines in 1942, of course. And I really go into that in great depth in Fire and Fortitude, the first volume. But what you see over time is an army that's getting more professional. It's getting to be better armed, better supplied, better commanders, better planners. Just like the U.S. itself, it's maturing. And so all these sort of larger kind of trends that you see playing out for the U.S. home front and, of course, U.S. naval power and all that, you also see for the Army. And so by 1944, the Army is an incredibly formidable fighting machine, and not just at like the combat soldier level, but logistically and in terms of engineering know-how and all the things you need to fight this war, supplying yourself, sustaining yourself in these kinds of environments, lesson learning, civil affairs, because as you move farther north, you're coming to more populated areas, especially when you come back to the Philippines, which is the last chapter, Island Infernos, is about the invasion of Leyte, which, by the way, in terms of the size of the American forces, is larger than the American contribution to the much more famous invasion of Normandy earlier that year. So you're seeing, just sort of operations at a scale that would have been unimaginable even in World War One. So this is a kind of citizen soldier army that I like to say has enough professional soldiers to become really good and reasonably well led, but not so many that it's just destroyed by corruption and careerism. So it's a pretty interesting balance that you're seeing there. Of course, by 1945, which you'll see in Volume 3, I mean, it's just at a completely different level.
Right. John, I really wish we could talk all day. Your trilogy is really remarkable. Some great narrative history, but really thought-provoking, very scholarly as well, scholarly insights, and just a smoothly written narrative. I mean, it's a remarkable achievement. So the book is Island Infernos, the American Army in the Pacific in 1944. So we'll look forward to the third volume, and I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah.
That was very insightful.
Thanks, Tony. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our library of interviews on World War II and also the Cold War, especially our series, The Cold War and the Presidency. And check out our free online textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, for more resources on World War II. Thank you very much for joining us.